Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Professor Casey. Today we're discussing Chapter 27 from David Emory Shi's America, A Narrative History. And this chapter deals specifically with the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the period known as the Red Scare. We've already used the term Red Scare once before when discussing the aftermath of World War I, and especially the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. It saw the topple of the Tsar and the installation of a new totalitarian regime. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, we have a similar situation where people are becoming much more concerned about the presence of communism, especially after the deals that FDR and Winston Churchill made with Joseph Stalin, granting him these vast areas of territory in Eastern Europe. So people are now concerned that communism has gained too much of a foothold in the world. And this also begins the period known as the Cold War. We'll discuss a little bit more about the Cold War in depth, but the Cold War is a very, very long, drawn-out period in U.S. history that takes up the vast majority of the 20th century. We have a period that lasts from roughly 1945 until about 1990, when the Cold War finally comes to an end. So we'll discuss the beginning of it here, moving forward. So in April of 1945, after the death of FDR from a massive cerebral hemorrhage, Harry Truman takes the presidency. And Truman's personality and his experience in politics is quite limited when compared to FDR. FDR had obviously a very long, drawn-out presidency. He served 3 full terms in office and began a 4th before he died. Before that, FDR also served as governor of New York. He served as a vice presidential candidate before that. So he has a long, drawn-out record, but Harry Truman, for all intents and purposes, was a shoe salesman before entering into politics. And he's very much an everyday person, right, when compared to FDR's more diplomatic approach to things. Harry Truman tends to be a little bit of a hothead, tends to kind of be blunt with his wording, tends to kind of tell it like it is, for better or for worse. And he's known for having a very short temper and for being rather profane, too. He's not known for carrying on very good interpersonal relations with individuals like Douglas MacArthur, for instance. Now, as I said before, this is the beginning of the period called the Cold War. And the Cold War is called a Cold War because it never actually reaches a higher temperature in terms of actual face-to-face direct combat with communist Russia. That's the primary reason it's called a Cold War. If it was a hot war, obviously, we would have a direct conflict between U.S. and Russian forces. But there are several intermediaries that tend to play the role of protagonist and antagonist in the midst of these two powers. And like we talked about at the end of the last chapter, we have 3 new designations that are given here. We have the First World, which is the United States and its allies, including Great Britain and France. We have the Second World, which is the Soviet Union and all of its allies. And then we have the Third World, right? Any country that does not openly ally itself with either side. So the beginning of the Cold War, anyway, is determined by several different factors here. Number one, the emergence of atomic warfare is something that is obviously unprecedented and quite frankly terrifying to everybody in the world, because the actual existence of this particular type of warfare is scary enough, but also the fact that the United States developed it and used it seemingly with abandon here. Harry Truman has dropped 2 bombs in very quick succession on Japan, a relatively small nation when compared to the United States, and the actual devastation that it caused in terms of the human factor, the lives lost, the suffering, and everything, tends to cause people to give the United States kind of a sidelong glance here. And so the rest of the world is now afraid that the United States is gotten a little bit too powerful, that it has this technology, and who is it going to use it on next? And of course, the U.S. is committed to capitalism in the midst of all this. We haven't really abandoned that idea yet. We also have the idea of self-determination at heart, right? This is something that the big 3, right, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt all agreed upon, right, that we're going to allow these nations that have been freed from the tyranny of fascism, we're going to allow them to build themselves back up. And we're also committed to the idea of religious freedom, as limited as it may be. Okay, the idea that we're not really going to, impose some kind of a state-sponsored religion on anybody. Okay, we are still committed to some sense of neutrality in that regard. On the other side of things, though, the USSR, the Soviet Union, is committed to just about the exact opposite of all three of those factors. Okay? For one thing, it is committed to controlling not only its own government, but its allies. Okay? And by allies, we really are saying the word subjects here. Okay? All of the Baltic nations, all of the Soviet nations are all essentially puppet nations that are controlled by Soviet Russia, okay? And specifically by Joseph Stalin. Ideological conformity is a very, very big feature of Russian communism here. Okay, we have the idea of a dictator here who is telling everybody exactly how they need to behave, and if they fall out of line in any way, at best they are very brutally corrected, and at worst they disappear and are never heard from again. And the third and final thing, of course, is that communism is ostensibly an atheistic religion, or an atheistic form of government. Okay, it has no, it removes religion because it believes that religion is actually more of a distraction from loyalty to the party. So the whole idea of what people typically quote Karl Marx, the founder of communism, as saying about religion being the opiate of the people or the opiate of the masses. It's not necessarily saying so much that religion is false or that religion is something that needs to be, put out of, commission or anything, but really that it's just a distraction, okay, that it's something that gets in the way. And the other thing, too, is that the Soviets are extremely paranoid, and when it comes to Joseph Stalin, comparing him to the likes of Hitler or Mussolini, in terms of paranoia, Joseph Stalin really rises above all the rest. Okay? He is constantly concerned that people are out to get him. He's concerned about his own allies and his own contingency plotting against him. He's constantly worried that he is going to be poisoned or assassinated. And he is constantly also trying to pit members of his own party against one another to try to see who is going to be more loyal to him. And so not only within is he concerned, but also in terms of his own borders. Okay, so the Soviet borders, whatever territory he has, he's worried that he's going to be invaded. Okay, and he has good reason to be concerned about this because he's already dealt with the treachery of Adolf Hitler. Okay, after signing the Pact of Non-Aggression with Hitler, in just a year or two, Hitler turns around and invades the Soviet Union anyway. Okay, so Stalin is kind of like, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you. Okay, that kind of thing. Or actually, it's the other way around, I beg your pardon. Fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Okay, so he has this idea that he's not willing to be fooled again. And by spring of 1945, the Soviet Union has already gone underway in annexing all these Eastern European territories, right? All of the Baltic states, including places like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, all these areas that have been essentially liberated from the control of Nazism are now being brought under the auspices of the Soviet Union. And so there's all these new little puppet governments that start to arise in all these little countries, right? Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, which, as we said before, has been selected for communist control, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. All of these nations are now effectively Soviet states. And again, just like we've seen with several different regimes that have come by already, it follows a very cliched pattern. Okay, all other political parties are completely abolished. Okay, and this is really Stalin going against the agreements that he's made with Churchill and with Roosevelt. Remember, we had this idea of self-determination and that we were going to allow open elections in Europe. Okay, and specifically in Eastern Europe. And Stalin has immediately reneged on that promise. Okay, so in other words, communism is the final say here. Okay, there is not really going to be any allowance for capitalism, for democracy, or anything like that to come in any way. And of course, Stalin also establishes the secret police and the KGB. Okay, and these act in a manner similar to the Gestapo, right? They will come in and when they find people who are social or political dissenters, and they silence them one way or another. Okay, either by arresting them and or torturing them and or executing them and or shipping them off to a gulag in Siberia. Okay, so there's all kinds of different options on the table with what can happen to an individual in the Soviet Union. And at the same time, too, because communism is, again, a totalitarian regime, it is total in terms of its level of control. All intellectual life and all cultural life is completely suppressed. Okay, so any semblance of free expression, freedom of the press, of art, or anything, it all comes under the auspices of the government. Okay, and the government has the final say in terms of what is actually shown to the people. And in the meantime, roughly 12 million Germans, Poles, and Hungarians are all either relocated to Western Germany, okay, to try to get away from the Soviet Union, or if they choose to remain and to try to protest, they get sent to Soviet prisons. And it's estimated that roughly 500,000 people end up dying in the process. Okay, and Joseph Stalin rules with an iron fist. Okay, he is not willing to suffer anyone who tells him otherwise. Okay, he has very much not only a dictator mentality, but almost a mafia mentality. Okay, if you are in his presence when he is corrected, he will make sure that you are silenced. Now, the following year, in February of 1946, Stalin immediately comes out in direct opposition now to capitalism, to the United States, and firmly establishes this idea of a first world versus a second world. Okay, so we immediately have a full polarization between the United States and the Soviet Union. Okay, Stalin immediately says that the Soviet Communist government is superior to all others, and says that peace with capitalism in any form is completely impossible. And remember, just a year before, the Soviets and the United States were fighting side by side against Nazi Germany. Okay, so this is a very quick turnaround. The U.S. State Department hires George Frost Kennan, a guy who is an analyst, to actually look at communism and to decide how this is going to be measured. Okay, how much of a threat is communism actually going to be to the United States? And Kennan comes up with what is now been termed the long telegram. It's a 5,000-word essay that is sent to Harry Truman and to the United States government, the powers that be, coming to the conclusion that Franklin Roosevelt was extremely misguided in trusting Stalin. Okay, and if you recall from the previous chapter, Roosevelt was not very trusting of Stalin to begin with. Okay, he viewed him as a necessary evil, and the idea that FDR was really in close communique with Stalin is kind of a misnomer. Okay, and really it's a matter of necessity ended up leading to kind of an unforeseen, or perhaps was foreseen, consequences. Kennan also comes to the conclusion that the Soviet goal is to build up military strength while undermining all capitalist stability. Okay, and this is something that the Soviets do manage to prove over time. Okay, the fact that they want to get rid of capitalism wherever they can find it. They want to supplant it with communist regimes, and at the same time, too, the communists want to build up as much of a military presence as they can to try to basically act as a deterrent in case the United States decides to invade. And Kennan comes up with the final conclusion that the best policy for the U.S. to follow here is to try to exercise some form of strategic containment of Soviet expansion. To, in other words, try to prevent the Soviets from expanding into new territory without resulting in open war. Okay, and this is an extremely fine line to have to walk here, because the Soviets are very aggressive. They do know that the United States has superior weaponry at this point. We have atomic warfare, and we have used it. Okay, so tensions are extremely high at this point, as you can imagine. And Kennan also states that he believes communism is eventually going to mellow out, that these tensions are eventually going to lessen over time, and that the communist system is not going to be self-sustaining for very long, that it will eventually collapse. And technically that does happen, but it takes it the better part of 40 years for it to happen. In February of 1947, things come to a head very quickly, because the British-backed monarchy that exists in Greece, okay, and Greece is sitting right on the edge of communist territory, okay. Hungary, which is right next to Greece, is already controlled by the communists. The Greek monarchy is actually being threatened to fall to communism, and the British, of course, who are U.S. allies, And so the U.S. is almost immediately forced to respond, right? In order to continue on with this idea of the United Nations and so forth, we have to actually go in and be willing to back our allies. And so Truman gets on the radio a few days later and actually calls for Congress to release $400 million in aid for both Greece and for Turkey. Okay, and remember, Turkey at this point is still considered an independent secular republic. Okay, the Ottoman Empire collapsed at the end of the First World War, and Greece and Turkey have a long history of rivalry between the two of them. In fact, in many cases, the Greeks and the Turks still hate each other even today. But at this point, they have to actually fight alongside one another to get rid of communism. And in the midst of Truman's speech, he uses this as a piece of leverage to try to get the American people to begin ramping up their fears of communism. He exaggerates communism as being an immediate threat and something that could potentially boil over into the United States at any given time. Okay, and he cites something that he refers to as the domino theory. Okay, and domino theory is used time and time again over the course of the next decade or two in terms of describing how communism tends to spread. Okay, and the idea is just like you would see with dominoes that are stacked straight up. When you tip one of them over and it knocks down the next one, you get a chain reaction where all the dominoes eventually end up falling. And so what Truman is saying is if one nation isolated ends up falling to communism, communism will continue to spread and all other nations around it will fall to communism in due course. And so he introduces what is now known as the Truman Doctrine. Okay, this is the U.S. foreign policy under Harry Truman. Okay, and most presidents, beginning with Truman going forward through the 20th century, each one has their own foreign policy that is a doctrine named after the president. Okay, so the Truman Doctrine says that the U.S. is willing to support the free people who resist any subjugation by an armed minority or an outside pressure. So in other words, if we have a communist regime that is coming into a country that is potentially either already an ally of the United States or a potential ally, we are obligated to intervene somehow and actually push communism out of the way. And the Secretary of State, a guy named George C. Marshall, thinks that Truman here is being way too provocative about this. Okay? He thinks that Truman is overstepping his bounds here and that trying to cite some kind of domino theory here is going to be too much of an alarmist thing. He thinks that the isolation of communism is supposed to be something that's done on a more economic and political way vis-a-vis what George Kennan had in mind. Okay? He doesn't believe that we need to have any kind of military intervention here, although that's really what Truman is after. Okay, Truman believes that if we use the military, we can nip this in the bud, we can get it done quickly. But Marshall and Kennan both believe that if we use the economy, if we use political strategies to get rid of this, then perhaps over time communism will eventually end up wearing down. Now, the Truman Doctrine ends up becoming a much more militaristic form of containment, as we have already seen. Okay, Truman is already very eager to use the military to try to suppress communism as much as he possibly can. Okay, and so the Truman Doctrine ends up becoming much more related to the use of the military than it does otherwise. Okay, and this is what really gets us involved more and more in international disputes. Okay, and that tends to be kind of the key feature of the Cold War in general, is that the United States and the Soviet Union are constantly working the strings of other nations in the world, and all of the different major conflicts that we see happen in the 20th century leading up until 1990 tend to be either the direct involvement of the U.S. and or the Soviet Union in some way. Okay, so as we'll see in ensuing chapters, all of the big conflicts that come about in the next few decades all tend to go back to this one particular event. Now, in May of 1947, the United States calls for this gigantic financial and technical assistance program to try to rebuild what is left of Europe, because as we've seen already in the First World War, Europe tends to bear the brunt of the conflict. Okay, and the first time around, there was no program of any kind to try to sponsor reconstruction. Okay, but in the aftermath of the Second World War, the Secretary of State here, George Marshall, comes up with the idea of something called the Marshall Plan. Okay, and this is where the U.S., now that it's in this prime position to actually help others, is actually going to do just that. Okay? For one thing, it's going to try to reconstruct the European economy in its entirety. It's going to try to get rid of all communist insurgencies, and this again falls in line with the Truman Doctrine. It pleases him. And try to build up some kind of a foreign market for American products, because now, as we've already seen during the 1920s, the U.S. is beginning to steer its economy much more into consumer products than anything else. Okay, and if we can get the former allies on our side, if we can get them to open up new markets in their own countries, then the U.S. is going to start making money hand over fist. And capitalism is really only going to be able to survive if it's going to be part of a worldwide system. And again, the U.S. is still primarily the only capitalist country anywhere in the world at this point, right? All of the others do operate either as a constitutional republic or democracy or something along those lines, but capitalism doesn't always go hand in hand with that. Okay, so we need some kind of an Americanized form of Europe. And that's what we end up having throughout the 20th century, more and more and more, as globalism continues. So in December of 1947, the Marshall Plan is submitted to Congress, and almost immediately the Republican Party dismisses it as some kind of a New Dealism, but this time for Europe. Okay, they believe that we're granting some sort of a welfare system for people who are not our responsibility. Okay, and in this particular instance, the U.S. is in a prime position to be able to do that. So in February of 1948, just a couple of months later, there is a communist-led coup that occurs in Czechoslovakia. Okay, and Czechoslovakia at this point is the last holdout for capitalism in Eastern Europe. Okay, this is really one of the only other countries anywhere in Europe that still has this small contingency of people who are capitalists. And once it's overrun by communism, now we have an excuse to try to put this into action. And so, immediately thereafter, the Marshall Plan is put into action. Okay, this insurgency clears the way and says, see, this is why we need this. And so from 1948 until 1951, the Marshall Plan continues in its entirety and ends up providing $13 billion to 16 different European nations to try to reconstruct their economies and their infrastructure. And it is a rousing success. It's actually the most successful peacetime diplomatic initiative in U.S. history. Okay, so it's actually something that becomes a feather in our cap for quite a while. By 1951, Western Europe has an industrial production level that is now 40% higher than it was before the war happened. And part of that, of course, as we've already discussed, has something to do with the idea of an Americanized form of Europe. And the Soviet Union, unsurprisingly, has refused to participate. Okay, so all other countries that are actually under the auspices of Soviet control, Albania, Bulgaria, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia, all continue to be impoverished. Okay, and so you also get a period of time here, especially in the early portion of the Cold War, where there is a large diaspora from Eastern Europe coming to the United States. Okay, so a lot of new immigrants who are coming from Eastern Europe from these former Soviet states are doing so to try to escape communism. And to back up a couple of years, right, as we've already discussed, the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the agreement is made among four different world powers, the U.S., Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, to divide Berlin, the capital of Germany, into four different quadrants, okay, four different zones of occupation here. Okay. And each one of these different zones, again, is going to be independently controlled for a while. Okay. It's also worth noting that Berlin is actually still on the Eastern German side of the border. Okay, so while Germany may be divided down the middle, you still have to go a few miles inside of Eastern Germany to actually get to Berlin. Okay, so Berlin is technically in Soviet-occupied territory. In 1948, though, 3 years after the war ends and after this agreement has been allowed to continue for a while, the British, the French, and the American zones, all three end up uniting into one gigantic government. Okay, so each of these three independent zones now are combined into one gigantic one. And they end up issuing a new government and a new currency called the Deutschmark, which you see up here at the top right in a little coin form. And Western Germany, right, which is on the other side of the border from Berlin, right, which is still the capitalist side of things, begins organizing its own different little state governments and drafting its own federal constitution. Okay, it's going to become a capitalist democracy. And when Joseph Stalin hears about what's happened here with these three zones combining with one another, he views this as a threat. Okay, because if you have four different areas, each one of which comprises 25% of a larger area, and suddenly all three of them of these others end up combining, you now have one group that occupies 75% and the Soviets, which occupy 25%. So naturally, this seems like something that could be, again, potentially a threat to him. And Stalin first acts by preventing this new Deutschmark currency from being delivered into Berlin. He says that it's on the inside of Soviet territory, and we do not want it here. And the Soviets continue in a couple of months by stopping all road and rail traffic into West Berlin. There is a short access corridor that you can see here on the map that goes from West Germany into Eastern Germany and lands in Berlin. Okay, and Stalin immediately shuts down all traffic into this. Okay, and Truman ends up reacting to this bit of aggression by ordering an embargo against all Soviet imports coming from East Germany into Western Germany. So now we're using economics already to try to get into this little conflict with one another. Okay, we have the U.S. and the Soviet Union now kind of butting heads with each other already. And by October, the supply lines have been cut so drastically that the U.S. and the British Air Forces are forced to fly in over 7 tons of supplies every single day and have airdrops into Berlin for the next 11 months. Okay, and you see a photograph here in the background, although it's kind of occluded by the title heading here, but you see a supply plane flying over and the people on the ground cheering. Okay, so these supplies have to be airdropped in crates and in pallets and so forth, and people have to kind of get by with what they have. And eventually Truman revives the military draft. Congress starts ramping up emergency funds again, just in case we end up getting involved in another war. But by May, the Soviets back down. Okay, May of 1949, the Soviets say they're going to lift the blockade and allow this to go back to the way it was. And so the Federal Republic of Germany is created in Western Germany. This is a constitutional democracy. And the German Democratic Republic, ironic title as it may be, the Soviet Communist government of East Germany is established on the East German side. Okay, so now we have effectively East Germany, which is Soviet occupied, and West Germany, which is democracy occupied. In April of 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty is signed by 12 different nations here. And those include the U.S., Great Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Canada, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, Norway, and Portugal. Okay? Eventually in 1952, Greece and Turkey joined the group, and in 1955, West Germany joins. Spain is the last holdout and joins in 1982. In the aftermath of the North Atlantic Treaty being signed, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is created. Okay, and this becomes the largest defensive alliance anywhere in the world. Okay, and what this amounts to is all of the members of NATO act as this large conglomerate. Okay, and so if one nation that is outside of NATO ends up attacking a NATO member, okay, then all other members of NATO are bound by this agreement to come to the aid of that other member. Okay, so an attack against one nation is going to be an attack against all of the nations listed above. And so the U.S. ends up committing itself for the first time to go to war on behalf of its allies rather than waiting for itself to be attacked. Okay, and this continues to be something that the U.S. uses from time to time all throughout the next several decades leading up to the present. In 1949, Congress allows $1 billion in military equipment to be granted to NATO members. And back up a couple of years, this is kind of out of order, Congress also passes the National Security Act. So this is what creates the Department of Defense as a permanent entity in the U.S. government to oversee the three branches of military that we have: the Army, the Navy, and the newly created Air Force, which is now separate from the Army. The National Security Council is created. Okay, and this is the permanent advisory group that exists in the government now to actually speak to the president, to act as a group of top specialists to try to figure out how international relations can be kept. The Joint Chiefs of Staff is also made a permanent entity. This is where you have the different heads of the armed forces who now act as advisors directly to the president. And the Central Intelligence Agency is also created, the CIA. Okay? And the CIA becomes, over time, a much more shady organization, as you will see as we go along in the ensuing chapters here. But it's supposed to coordinate different global intelligence gathering activities. So in other words, it's supposed to send spies to other nations to figure out what enemies could potentially be doing, if any interests of the United States are being infringed upon. Okay? And over time, this ends up becoming kind of a puppet agency and is used for, again, some rather shady dealings over time. And in 1952, the National Security Agency is created. This is created within the Department of Defense, and it is supposed to, quote-unquote, encrypt government communications to try to intercept communications from other nations and to try to make sure that all communications from the United States to its allies are kept secret. Okay? So we're not willing to really make any future mistakes with allowing things to fall into the wrong hands. And this is the first time that the federal government directly begins surveying Americans for the first time to try to make sure that they are not any kind of a potential threat. Okay, it actually begins to look at its own people as being potential threats. Now, concerning the establishment of the State of Israel, this is an extremely controversial event and something that continues to be controversial even today. To back up a little bit, Palestine, the area which is eventually cordoned off in one particular section for the creation of Israel, has been a British protectorate since the end of the First World War. Okay? If you recall, at the end of World War I, the Allied powers end up going into the Middle East and enacting what is called the mandate system. Okay? Different Allied powers end up taking control of different areas of the Middle East and using them as quote-unquote protectorates. In other words, you have an Allied power, an imperial power like Great Britain or France and so forth, that is actually controlling the local government and is actually providing some semblance of aid, perhaps some money to it, some sort of patronage, and is acting as a quote-unquote protector from other powers surrounding it. Okay, and Palestine has been an Islamic region for quite a long time at this point. Okay, for several hundreds of years. And the groups that we discussed in the last chapter, a group known as Zionists, begin to emerge now, especially in the aftermath of the Second World War. Okay, and this is a group of Jews who are eager to have a separate Jewish nation. Okay, and looking back through the history of the Jewish people, going all the way back, if you like to look at it this way, going back to biblical times, there has been a long drawn out epoch, if you like, of Jews attempting to obtain an area of land that they can call their own home country. Okay? And this has become kind of a stereotypical association with the Jewish people, this idea of something known as, quote-unquote, the wandering Jew. Okay? That Jews have never had a homeland of their own, that they have an ethnic and a religious identity, but not a national identity. Okay? And so the creation of a separate Jewish state is something that the Zionists are eager for. Okay, and the idea of Zion, okay, Zion is a holy city that is supposed to exist for the Jews near the end of time. Okay, and remember, in the aftermath of Kristallnacht, in the aftermath of the different pogroms, the ghettos, and the Holocaust that is occurring during World War II, there is a Zionist movement to try to relocate the Jewish people back to the Middle East, back to this sort of homeland situation. And the fulfillment of that is the creation of the State of Israel. So again, this big Zionist migration that occurs after the threat of the Nazis in the 30s and 40s begins to gain more and more traction after World War II comes to an end. And in 1947, the United Nations, which is now made up of several dozens of nations all over the world, votes to partition or divide Palestine into two separate states. One for Jews, which is to become Israel, and one for the Arab Islamic states, which is to remain Palestine. Okay, and this particular event becomes a precipitating event that leads to much more intercultural conflict throughout the next several decades, and something that, quite frankly, continues to the present. Okay? While the Jews are in agreement and are excited about this with what the United Nations want, the Arabs, the Islamic Arabs, are extremely violently opposed to this. Okay, and violent protests begin almost immediately. Okay? The creation of a separate Jewish nation in Palestine is regarded as an act of war by the Arabs. Okay? And the Arabs immediately attack the newly established state of Israel in 1948. And hundreds of people end up being killed before the Jewish militia called the Haganah ends up gaining control of the region and stabilizing it. David Ben-Gurion is elected as the first president of Israel in 1948, and he is the one who declares Israel's independence after British protection ends up leaving the area. Okay, so he says that now Israel is a separate nation. It's able to defend and protect itself. And to legitimize things in the eyes of the rest of the world, the two major superpowers, the First and Second Worlds, controlled by Truman and Stalin, both openly recognize the presence of Israel as a separate state on the national stage. Okay? And anytime this happens in the 20th century, anytime one of the major superpowers ends up recognizing another nation, it grants it legitimacy in the eyes of the rest of the world. And of course, this is still an extremely sore point for Palestinians. Okay? They still believe that Israel is not a legitimate state. And in May of 1948, in the very next day, in fact, the Arab League nations, which contain Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt, all invade Israel, beginning a series of constant warfare that continues, again, all the way to the present, in one form or another. In May of 1949, a very uneasy peace agreement is reached through the UN, with Israel gaining membership. Okay, so the UN now says that while Israel is a new member, right, if any nation tries to attack Israel, all of the members of the UN now are obligated to come to its defense. Okay, so Palestine is now kind of left out in the cold here. And again, there's still plenty of resentment over this. And so Israel is allowed to retain the Palestinian territory that was sectioned off, and Palestinian Arabs tend to lose just about everything. Okay, in some cases they are forced to relocate. And again, continued resentment about this particular event occurs even to this very day. Now, when it comes to Truman's domestic policies, even though his international policies have a limited amount of success, right, and they actually set a lot of new precedents for future presidents, his domestic policies tend to fail more often than not. Okay, in September of 1945, right after the war ends, he presents a 21-point program to Congress to try to guide America out of wartime and into peacetime, to try to make the transition a little bit easier than what we saw in the First World War. Okay, after the First World War, there were a lot of race riots, there were a lot of strikes that occurred, a lot of community violence that ended up ensuing, just because of resentment, because soldiers who were coming home didn't have jobs. And so he tries to nip several of these items in the bud, right? He tries to provide unemployment insurance, a higher minimum wage, low-cost housing projects, and development projects in certain regions to allow people to actually have jobs when they come home. And again, there is a limited amount of success here, but the key word is limited. Okay? Because between 1945 and 46, there's roughly 700,000 military veterans who have been discharged and are returning home. Okay, and the amount of jobs that are available for them when they get home is very, very small in compared to the number of people who need them. And the armed forces dwindles rather significantly, dramatically, in fact, after the Second World War. And this is a key feature also after any major conflict that occurs. The U.S. constantly tries to disband its military after each big conflict during peacetime. So armed forces go down from 12 million men down to 1.5 million. Okay, so this is a major drop. And the Employment Act in 1946 authorizes Truman and the rest of the government to try to promote some kind of an employment, some kind of production means, and purchasing power to allow veterans to have jobs, okay? And just to allow Americans in general to have jobs so that we don't slide back into another depression. And of course, Republicans and the conservative Southern Democrat contingency in Congress are all in opposition to this because they believe that this is another continuance of New Dealism. Okay, and Harry Truman himself is a progressive Democrat, just like Franklin Roosevelt was. And so all of the different wartime economic controls are removed to try to allow consumerism, to try to allow capitalism to resume its practices. And unfortunately, people almost immediately begin price gouging. Okay, a lot of consumer products end up spiking in value, and now people aren't able to afford them anymore. Okay. To make matters worse, a lot of labor unions demand pay increases, and we end up with a lot of strikes ensuing. So a lot of the same problems that we saw in the First World War continue even after the Second one. And Truman does his best to take control of coal mines, to try to guarantee cooperation with the managers, and he even threatens to, in some cases, reinstitute the military draft and draft a lot of railroad workers who refuse to go back to work. He says, if you're not going to work here, we're going to send you off and make you join the army. And of course, this is not a very popular thing in the eyes of the conservatives in America, particularly. Okay, the working class in particular start to view Harry Truman as someone who is not really on their side. Okay, and he tries to lift all the wartime controls on consumer prices, and grocery prices in particular begin to skyrocket. Okay, we've gotten rid of all of the rationing that we had during the war, and so people are now out to get whatever they can. And the Republicans and the conservatives in America are already beginning to target Congress and trying to regain seats during the midterm elections of 1946. Okay? All of the problems in the domestic sphere are suddenly being blamed on Harry Truman and all of his failing policies. And it's estimated that 14.5 million workers in the U.S. are now unionized, right? There's more power in unions than there ever has been before. And so this is a large lobbying sector and a large area of influence now on politics, both in the presidency and in Congress. And unsurprisingly, with all of the social temperature rising here, the Republicans end up regaining control of both houses of Congress for the first time since 1928. Okay, so it doesn't look good for Harry Truman and for the future of a Democratic president. In 1947, the new Congress under the Republicans passes what's called the Taft-Hartley Labor Act, and this allows all employers to campaign against unions. Okay, and so this is a very, very highly politicized situation here, where you have a brand new Republican Congress that is now openly against unions. And the Republicans at this point are an extremely conservative contingency. They're becoming more conservative over time, that is. And initially, they also began to look at as labor unions as being directly related to socialism and by proxy communism. Okay, so this is kind of an anti-communist policy, a veiled one, a very thinly veiled one on their part. And they also outlaw any unions from coercing any workers that work nearby to join them. Okay, so in other words, if you are a member of a union, you can't go around recruiting and forcing people to join. Okay, if people don't want to join, they don't have to. And it requires all union leaders to take a loyalty oath to the U.S. government and to the company itself, basically saying that, we're not loyal to communism, or if we are a member of the Communist Party, we're loyal to the U.S. Constitution first. Okay. And so all federal employee strikes are now banned. So if you are a federal employee, if you work for the government, you're not allowed to go on strike. Okay. And so this is something that is kind of an extension of what we saw during the 1920s with Calvin Coolidge, right? When the Boston police went on strike. Okay. Coolidge came out and said you were not allowed to do this and put people in danger. And it also imposes an 80-day cooling off period after any dangerous strike occurs. Okay, so if a strike actually ends up happening and some sort of physical violence is threatened, there is a mandatory 80-day cooling off period that has to ensue. And so now all these union-only workplaces are no longer allowed to exist, okay? It says that people have a right to work, and they don't have to be a member of a union in order to work in a certain place. So union-only workplaces are no longer allowed to exist. Unsurprisingly here too, right now we have a Congress and a president that are diametrically opposed to one another, and usually the president is the one who ends up losing out to this over time. Okay. In this case, Truman ends up vetoing the Taft-Hartley bill. He does gain some support from the working class Democrats here for doing this, and those who join the Republican Party end up looking at this and saying, well, if Truman is really on our side, then maybe we need to support him instead. Okay, so again, just politics as usual, as you would expect in the U.S. But Truman's veto is unfortunately overturned by Congress, okay, because Congress is so potentially powerful here. This ends up weakening Truman's resolve quite a bit. In the aftermath of the Second World War, we also enter into the first period of the actual modern civil rights movement in the United States. And the Soviet Union attempts to use capitalism as a way of saying that America's problems are really its own invention. Okay, that the idea of American racism is something that is a side effect of capitalism, that this constant need for competition and control of wages, control of certain social strata and so forth is all an invention of capitalism, and that communism doesn't have this problem. And on paper, that's exactly what communism professes. Okay, socialism and by extension communism state that there should be no social classes of any kind. Okay, so no working class, no middle class, no upper class, or anything of that sort. Right, everybody should have essentially the same amount of things, all of which are owned and operated by the government. So personal property and private property are kind of a non-existent entity within communism. And so communism says, if you look at our system, it's so much better because we don't have to worry about this. Also, the fact that Soviet Russia is relatively, how can I put it, monoethnic in terms of the different ethnic strata that exist in Soviet Russia. It's a very different social makeup than what we see in the United States. Okay, the United States is a nation of immigrants. Okay, and so we have several different groups that are all vying for one reason or another for control here. And unfortunately, suppression is a side effect of that. Okay, again, there is no excuse for it, obviously, but that is the way that capitalism tends to operate. Okay, usually for worse. And so early proponents of the civil rights movement in the United States include two individuals that really don't gain a whole lot of attention just because they are so early on in the movement. Okay, and they are Bayard Rustin, who you see at the top, and A. Philip Randolph at the bottom. Okay, and both of these men are extremely instrumental in pushing for the first real end to discrimination in the armed forces and in federal government employment. Okay, Bayard Rustin, who you see there at the top, is even more controversial because he is openly homosexual. Okay, during a time when, again, homosexuality was a crime in the United States, and he was not willing to suppress that, not willing to actually try to hide it. And A. Philip Randolph, by the way, also organized a march on Washington when Franklin Roosevelt was president, roughly 2 decades before Martin Luther King ever did. Okay, and black veterans tend to be the most highly outspoken against bigotry. Okay, again, a lot of white veterans are not really eager to do this, but black veterans are eager to do so because they've served alongside. They've done their duty. They've served their country. They've protected its citizens, quite often at the expense of their lives. And so in 1946, a Committee on Civil Rights is created to try to investigate racial violence in the U.S. Okay? It produces a federal anti-lynching bill. Okay? And by the way, the lynching in the United States was not voted to be a federal hate crime until this year, until 2020. It has taken them that long. This only happened within the past month and a half. Let's see here. An abolition of the poll tax is another thing. Poll taxes were a form of institutionalized racism, right, where you actually had to pay to vote. And if you were from a poor or working class, specifically if you were a minority who was part of that and you couldn't afford it, then your vote would not count in politics and your voice couldn't be heard. And a Voting Rights Act also was passed to try to protect the voting rights of African Americans, of minorities, and also an end to racial segregation in the armed forces and public transportation. Okay, the public transportation part doesn't gain a whole lot of traction until we see the emergence of Rosa Parks here shortly. But the armed forces one does actually end up going through toward the end of Truman's presidency and with the beginning of the Eisenhower administration. And Truman bans racial discrimination in the federal government for the first time in 1948. And racial segregation in the armed forces is finally banned on July 30th, 1948. Now, in the public sphere, and outside of the federal government and outside of politics, the Brooklyn Dodgers end up recruiting Jackie Robinson as the first African American to play in Major League Baseball in an integrated way. Okay, remember, up until this point, baseball has been in existence for several decades at this point. It's been considered America's national pastime for a long time. But if you're African American and you're a baseball player, you're forced to play in the so-called Negro leagues, okay, an actual segregated league completely separate from white leagues. But Jackie Robinson is one of the first major league players to actually break that barrier and play on the part of an actual integrated team. And he gains a lot of death threats for this, actually. A lot of baseball fans who are not willing to accept this boycott the Dodgers games. They end up having protests in some cases. And again, Jackie Robinson himself gets death threats. At the same time, too, though, he is actually named Rookie of the Year the same year that he actually gets in. Okay, so he does gain recognition. And the particular saying that goes along with this is many historians make the incorrect statement that Jackie Robinson was good enough to play Major League Baseball on a white team, but that's not the case. He's always been good enough, okay? But it's that he was allowed to play in a Major League Baseball team with a white team. And Mexican Americans also continue to face a lot of discrimination, particularly in the West and in the South. Schools in Arizona, in New Mexico, Texas, and California all attempt to segregate Mexican students from white students. Okay, so and again, this is still only about a decade after the U.S. Census begins to designate an Hispanic ethnicity separate from white ethnicity. Okay, if you recall from the 1920 census, it estimated that over 95% of America was white because it continued to include other ethnicities in this heading. Okay, so this is the first time that it's tried to separate them, but again, it's done so to an extreme degree. And roughly 500,000 Mexican-American veterans are also denied access to a lot of the GI benefits that have been granted to white soldiers. Okay, and that includes funerals, unfortunately, in many cases. In 1948, though, the American GI Forum is actually organized by a former combat surgeon named Dr. Hector Perez Garcia, who you see here at the bottom. And he is specifically known for stressing formal education for Mexican Americans. He believes that in order to gain social upward mobility in the United States, like a lot of predecessors in other civil rights movements, you need to have a formal education. You need to be able to to have this under your belt and to say that you are an educated person with dignity living in the United States. And he also lobbies to end poll taxes as well, just like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin do. And he also specifically sues for Latino rights to serve on juries. This is something else that's denied them along the same lines that we see denied to African Americans in the South. And he also tries to develop schools for jobless veterans as well, right? Schools that have specific like trade schools, right, where you can go and learn a specific trade as a mechanic or an electrician or something along those lines. Now, after Harry Truman's first term ends, the public is really pretty dissatisfied with him. Okay, they're really not happy with the way that he's handled things. They believe that his, especially in terms of his domestic policies. And a lot of political analysts believe that he is only going to be a one-term president. Okay, they believe that so much of his stuff is so unpopular that he has such a low approval rating that he's not going to be reelected. And in July of 1947, Truman does his best to get Dwight Eisenhower to run on the Democratic ticket in his stead, okay, because he knows that Eisenhower is considered a war hero. Okay, Eisenhower, of course, was the five-star general who led the U.S. forces to victory in Europe. And the Democratic Party ends up splitting in two, especially after Dwight Eisenhower refuses. Okay, and so Southern conservatives end up resenting all of Truman's civil rights policies. Okay, they're not happy with the idea of granting any kind of removal of segregation or discrimination in the armed forces. They don't like the idea of a federal anti-lynching bill. So white supremacy is still alive and well in the South at this point. And the Southern Democrats have not yet gone over to the Republican Party side. And left-wing Democrats also are not on his side either. They think that Truman's firing of the Secretary of Commerce, Henry Wallace, is a big mistake. Okay, Wallace actually came out criticizing the anti-Soviet policies. Okay, all the ones that Truman began to try to implement in the Truman Doctrine. Okay, and Wallace was one of the individuals who said that we need to use anti-Soviet policies only when it comes to economics and that sort of thing, right? Rather than actually using the military. Okay, and so Truman fired him for basically disagreeing. So now Truman has lost the support of conservatives and of progressives as well, liberals. Okay, so he's kind of a man almost without a party here. And Truman ends up mounting a re-election campaign on something that he calls the fair deal. Okay, he believes that there is supposed to be some kind of way that he can manage to appease both sides of the aisle here and continue forward with what he has in mind. Okay, for one thing, he wants to ensure civil rights for all Americans, okay, regardless of ethnicity, race, creed, etc. He also wants to try to increase federal aid for education, okay, especially now that we have more soldiers who are eager to get into schools and to try to gain a college degree. He also wants to expand all unemployment and retirement benefits, especially to people who are not able to get jobs, and to try to create some kind of system of national health insurance. And again, this is very, very far ahead of its time, and we don't see this implemented until Barack Obama becomes president. And he also wants to try to allow rural people to connect to electricity. Okay, there is still a very large part of the southern United States, especially in the Appalachian region, the Ozark regions of the United States, where the poorer regions of society still don't have electricity or running water. Okay, so this is a large limitation for them that he wants to eradicate. And he also wants to increase the minimum wage. Now, when the election of 1948 rolls around, okay, we have New York Governor Thomas Dewey running once again on the Republican ticket. And Dewey at this point has run for the last, I believe it's the last 3 or 4 consecutive presidential elections on the Republican ticket, and he's lost every single time. Okay, the first few times to Franklin Roosevelt, and in this particular instance, you see here in the background Harry Truman holding up a newspaper. It's difficult to see what it says, but if you look over here on the top right side, you see the actual newspaper that he's holding, and it says Dewey defeats Truman. Okay, and this becomes a big embarrassment for the Chicago Daily Tribune, who actually publishes this, because the general public consensus is that Truman is going to lose this election because people don't like him very much. But he actually ends up winning the election. Surprisingly enough, beating Thomas Dewey. And so Truman is actually holding up the newspaper saying that Dewey defeats Truman to try to basically mock the Chicago Daily Tribune. Okay, and I believe this actually becomes a Pulitzer Prize winning photograph for what ends up happening here, because it's a complete upset for Dewey. Meanwhile, Dwight Eisenhower constantly refuses the Democrats' request to try to run in place of Truman in the midst of all this. Okay, Eisenhower, ironically, actually ends up running on the Republican ticket later. Southern Democrats completely walk out of the National Committee over the civil rights question. Okay, they don't like the idea of granting civil rights to minorities at this point. And in July of 1948, the Southern Democrats actually are so incensed by what Truman is trying to do that they actually form a separate party that they call the Dixiecrat Party. They nominate a fellow named Strom Thurmond on a states' rights ticket and denounce civil rights altogether. And so the Dixiecrat Party actually becomes what is a very thinly veiled white supremacist party that acts as a third party in politics. So again, the emergence of a brand new third party here, again, very much in a social justice question that is actually at heart here. On July 23rd, Henry Wallace is nominated by the Progressive Democrats, okay, and Truman is actually renominated to the Democratic ticket in the final say, and he does actually win the election, again, in a very big upset to Thomas Dewey. And surprisingly enough, and an even further amount of surprise here, the Democrats regain control of both houses of Congress. So against all odds, Truman goes from the very bottom back to the very top here, and actually regains control of the legislative and executive branches. But despite this big victory here, most of his fair deal ideas are actually scrapped by Congress because they believe they can't be effectively implemented. Okay? So ideas like an actual protection for civil rights in the country, for state-sponsored education, for government-sponsored healthcare, most of that tends to be either whittled down or thrown out completely. Now, in 1949, after Truman is reelected, he starts to ramp up his anti-communist policies. Okay? And he has 3 different pillars in mind for this. Number 1, the United Nations, which is primarily associated with the U.S. and its allies. Okay, so most constitutional democracies and capitalist-friendly systems, right, are all members of the United Nations. The Marshall Plan, which is used to bolster up the economies of Great Britain and of most of mainland Europe, and the presence of NATO as well, okay, as this defensive deterrent here to try to prevent any kind of open conflict with communist nations. And the other issue that occurs in the midst of all this is the Chinese Civil War, which has kind of been going on in the background in the midst of World War II. Okay, the Japanese have over time kind of begun to turn their attention away from China to fight the United States in the Pacific and so forth. And Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalist Chinese, ends up fleeing mainland China to the island of Taiwan. And so he ends up actually leading a nationalist Chinese government in Taiwan as a separate nation in exile thereafter. And Mao Zedong, the leader of the communist forces, ends up taking over mainland China and turns China into an effectively communist country. Meanwhile, the U.S.'s worst fears end up coming true here. Because sometime in the early 1950s, the Soviets end up obtaining nuclear weapons technology and successfully detonate an atomic bomb. And immediately thereafter, Harry Truman, in an almost panicked state here, ends up escalating U.S. nuclear research. Okay, he does his best to enter into, he actually doesn't try to enter into, but effectively does, enter into an arms race with the Soviet Union to gradually enhance and increase the potency of a super bomb, okay, something that ends up becoming a hydrogen bomb. And this arms race continues throughout the entirety of the Cold War, right? All the way up into the late 1980s, do we still see the U.S. presidents constantly coming into the brink of mutually assured destruction with the Soviet Union. In January of 1950, Truman orders the National Security Council to try to assess America's role in international affairs. How much do we need to actually participate? And the document called NSC 68 is a report that calls for a much more robust effort to try to contain communism. Okay, rather than going on the defensive, we need to have a much more offensive policy here. And the bottom line here is that the National Security Council, through its own limited means, estimates that there is going to be a Soviet invasion of Western Europe by the year 1954. Okay, so there's only 4 years ahead of them to actually try to prevent this from occurring, if it actually does happen or not. And the report also states that the U.S. is at risk for total annihilation. Okay, so if the Soviets have in fact obtained nuclear technology, if they are able to build multiple atomic bombs, we've already seen the devastation that occurred in Japan if multiple bombs are dropped on the United States, it could be game over. And so Truman immediately begins imposing much more economic controls in the United States and increases taxes yet again to try to inflate the federal budget and to have some sort of savings basically set aside just in case we need to increase our nuclear stockpiles. Now, one of the earliest conflicts of the Cold War, considered to be, in the grand scheme of things, a minor war, but one that technically is still going on today, is the Korean War. And Korea is one of those other wars that if you ask the typical person on the street why it began, why it was fought, why is it still being fought, it's very difficult for them to come up with a straight answer. And the Korean War is a direct branch off of the immediate conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. It's directly concerned with capitalism versus communism, specifically on the Korean Peninsula. Now, in the aftermath of World War II, again, going back to 1945, the different territorial acquisitions that the two major superpowers have at the end of the war are still to blame for these major conflicts that we see, particularly with Korea. For one thing, mainland China is now occupied by communist forces led by Mao Zedong, and Mao Zedong is directly backed and financed and sponsored by Soviet Russia. So now China and Russia, both of which are immediately on each other's doorsteps, now have this long, gigantic presence of communism all throughout Eastern Asia and into Eurasia. Japan, meanwhile, has been fostered into recovery by the United States. We've gone in and actually taken over the Japanese government and have sponsored some kind of a constitutional democracy. Korea, meanwhile, has been divided at the 38th parallel, right in the very center of the country. You see it here on the map. North Korea, which is, of course, in the northern part of the country there, the red portion, is occupied by Soviet troops and becomes a communist nation over time, and is led by Kim Il-sung. And Kim Il-sung is the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. And as you can see, they are spitting images of one another. The grandson is very much in the spirit and in the image of the grandfather. And Kim Il-sung establishes the People's Democratic Republic of Korea. Again, just like what we saw with Eastern Europe, this is a very, very ironic name for the country because there is nothing democratic about it, and it is certainly not a republic. It is a communist nation. And South Korea, meanwhile, has been occupied by U.S. forces, led by the Republic of Korea with Syngman Rhee as its president. So now we have one island or one particular peninsula, one country that is one gigantic peninsula here. The northern part of the country is a communist country. The southern part is a democratic country sponsored by the U.S. So this is almost a worst-case scenario, You have two diametrically opposed governments and ideologies sharing the same general territory with one another. And in 1948, the Soviets and the U.S. forces end up withdrawing from Korea and leave the country basically to act out its own conflict with itself. So 2 million Koreans living in the northern part of the country who want to escape communism go to South Korea. And in January of 1950, the U.S. Secretary of State says that U.S. involvement in defending Japan and the creation of a defensive perimeter in the Pacific Ocean is paramount here. We need to get involved. Again, we don't need to abandon Korea here. In order to defend Japan from communism, we also need to have another presence in South Korea. And his words carry a little bit of weight here, because only about 6 months later, North Korea ends up invading South Korea. And in just a matter of 3 days, the capital of South Korea, Seoul, is captured by the North Koreans. Now, Truman looks at this and immediately says that this is a justification for the Truman Doctrine. He says this is a justification for that, and also proves that the domino theory is a sound theory. That if you have a communist country that is knocking on the door of a capitalist nation, then communism is going to try to take over. And here it is. So Truman does something that is extremely controversial here. It's something that has been attempted to be prevented, at least, by several congressional presences all the way through the present here. But Truman bypasses Congress completely and declares war on North Korea with the backing of the United Nations instead. And he calls it a police action rather than an actual war. Okay, so Truman is he's exercising a very strategic loophole here to get his way. Okay, so in other words, typically a president has to request permission from Congress in order to declare war on any other country anywhere in the world. But here, Truman has actually bypassed the entirety of the U.S. government and gone straight to the United Nations. Okay. Unfortunately, this is what conservatives were afraid was going to happen with the League of Nations, that the U.S. government was going to be essentially looked at as inferior to the United Nations. And unfortunately, Truman has kind of fishtailed a little bit on this, so not exactly operating above board here. And the Soviets end up boycotting the United Nations for not actually recognizing communist China. And instead, the United Nations has been recognizing nationalist China, okay, the island of Taiwan as being the legitimate government. So the Soviets are already angry with the United Nations over this, and they are constantly trying to support communist China in the midst of this. So again, more fuel to the fire. And the UN instead calls for international assistance to be sent to South Korea to send North Korea back over the 38th parallel, okay, and to try to repel it. And Truman ends up appointing Douglas MacArthur as the supreme commander of UN forces here. Now, in September of 1950, the Republic of Korea and UN forces are having a really tough go of it. I mean, you can see here in the background the sheer level of destruction that occurs in Korea. The North Korean people, for one thing, are in the midst of what is essentially a famine. Okay, and all the way from the 1950s to the present, North Korea has exercised a totalitarian level of authority over its people. Okay, and while the other countries of the world that do have a totalitarian regime, okay, at this point, specifically Soviet Russia, while these countries specifically look at the citizen as the property of the state and are obligated to feed them and house them and give them education and jobs and so forth, North Korea is not able to fulfill that promise. And so the people end up starving. On average, if you look at a North Korean soldier compared to a South Korean soldier, as time wears on, a typical North Korean soldier is roughly 6 inches shorter than a South Korean soldier because of decades of famine and malnourishment, maltreatment. Okay. Several different instances have occurred now where, especially in the present day, you see this happen from time to time. North Korean soldiers will actually, and North Korean citizens will actually try to defect over to the South Korean side because it's so difficult to live in North Korea. Okay. And North Korea attempts its best to actually try to keep up appearances at all times. Okay. Any type of, if the news in the United States is allowed to send a representative to North Korea, much of the social life in the country is actually staged. Okay. Under Kim Il-sung, the entirety of the country actually ends up changing over to what it essentially changes from a communist regime to a cult of personality. Okay, and it can be deemed Kim Il-sungism, essentially. Okay, to the point where you have the entirety of the life of a North Korean citizen is the abject worship of the dear leader. Okay, that is the entire purpose of being a North Korean citizen. There is no social life. There is no public life to speak of. All films are about Kim Il-sung. All books are about Kim Il-sung. All television programs, all operas, all theater performances, all education is about him. All parades are about him. All holidays are about him. Okay, it is a total overhaul of an entire culture of people to the worship of a single individual. And it's worth noting, too, in the present day, anytime a foreign leader ends up writing to the current leader of North Korea, whoever it happens to be, they don't refer to him as Mr. President. They refer to him either as Mr. Secretary or, in the case of Kim Jong-un, Mr. Marshal. Okay, Marshal is what they refer to him as. because the current leader of North Korea is not actually the president. Okay, the president of North Korea for all time is Kim Il-sung. Okay, a man who, in today's terms, has been dead for roughly 25 years. Okay, it has been deemed a necrocracy by at least one particular journalist who traveled there, a government that is essentially run by a dead man. Okay, so it's very unique in world politics. September 15th of 1950, to get back to the original narrative here, Douglas MacArthur ends up staging a surprise amphibious landing at Incheon. Okay, Incheon is actually above the 38th parallel in North Korean territory behind enemy lines. And only about 1/4 of North Korean soldiers end up making it back across the 38th parallel because MacArthur ends up closing them off and sandwiching them in on two sides and ends up massacring 3/4 of them. South Korea ends up retaking Seoul a few days later, and it seems like things are finally beginning to subside a bit. But unfortunately, Douglas MacArthur gets a little bit too full of himself. And instead, he decides he's going to persuade Harry Truman to allow the UN forces to cross over the 38th parallel and invade North Korea instead. Okay? If he had left things as they were, the country would still be where it was, right? They would still have a border at the 38th parallel, but hostilities would have ceased quite a bit earlier. In October of 1950, UN forces end up approaching Pyongyang. And Pyongyang is the current, and was at the time still, the capital of North Korea. Okay, and the capital city of North Korea, if you look at it today, has not effectively changed at all since 1950. Concrete buildings, the only real new developments are statues of Kim Il-sung and his son Kim Jong-il, who died in 2010. Okay, so all monuments to the great leader and the dear leader, as they are called, right, the father and the son, are the only new developments in North Korea. Okay, all of the other images that you might see of storefronts and so forth, quite often they contain fake props to give the appearance of being a prosperous nation. Okay, in modern terms, North Korea, I believe only about 6 people in the country have access to the internet, just to give you a sense of how the ratio. In October 15th, Truman ends up forced to fly all the way out to Wake Island because he believes that Douglas MacArthur is losing his mind. He tries to get MacArthur to stop all advances, says, if you continue to do this, you are going to not only provoke the North Koreans, but also the Soviets and the Chinese. Okay, and China is on the northern border of North Korea. Okay, so we're inching closer and closer. We're poking the bear, as it were, more and more. And China has already vowed to intervene on behalf of North Korea if we continue to advance. Okay, and again, Truman is trying to stop MacArthur from continuing here. He believes that if you continue to do this, you are going to cause the war to spiral out of control. On October 20th, 5 days later, MacArthur refuses to listen to Truman and enters Pyongyang. 6 days after that, he continues to advance all the way up to Chosun on the Yalu River. The Yalu River is the border between North Korea and China. And within a month, 300,000 Chinese troops pour over the border into North Korea, attack U.S. forces, and chase them all the way down across past the 38th parallel and invade South Korea all over again. Okay. And by January 15th of 1951, the Chinese and the North Koreans recapture Seoul. Okay. So we're right back to square one just because MacArthur wouldn't listen to reason. And because Truman is becoming more and more critical of MacArthur's strategies here, or lack thereof, MacArthur is lashing out, okay, and he's become more and more belligerent in his attacks. He requests, for one thing, 34 atomic bombs and air raids on China to ensure a decisive victory here. Okay? The problem, though, is by this point, the type of atomic warfare that the United States has managed to develop over time, right, to try to use as some sort of a deterrent to Soviet nuclear technology has far surpassed what we used on Japan during World War II. Okay, By the time we get into the 1950s and especially into the 60s, the hydrogen bombs, the H bombs that have been developed by this point are roughly 100,000 times stronger than those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, if you use one of those things, which has never actually been used on an enemy any time from this point going forward to the present, just one of those can irradiate the entire planet and potentially kill half-life on the planet. Okay, so for MacArthur to request 34 of them is quite frankly insane. Okay, and he either doesn't understand or does not care. And he believes that by losing the Asian continent, if we end up losing the subcontinent of Asia in this, it's going to lead to another European war. Okay, and MacArthur is basically, in the eyes of Truman at least, just warmongering here, right? He's eager for a fight. By the end of January, though, the UN forces do manage to rally a little bit, and Truman attempts to negotiate North Korea, surpassing MacArthur's demands, trying to appease North Korea as much as he can. Douglas MacArthur, meanwhile, writes a very strongly worded letter calling Harry Truman a son of a bitch, for one thing. And Truman is so flabbergasted by this that he takes it to Congress and reads it out loud openly on the congressional floor. 6 days later, Douglas MacArthur is fired and is replaced by General Matthew Ridgway, who resumes control of UN forces in Korea thereafter. 66% of Americans, though, are in opposition to what Truman does here. They have been ramped up so much in their concern about communism that they believe that Truman has now undermined the anti-communist effort. In June 24th of 1951, the Soviet UN representative ends up proposing a ceasefire along the 38th parallel. Okay, and on July 10th, peace talks begin to ensue at Panmunjom, which is in South Korea, near the demilitarized zone, which is the modern-day border between North and South Korea. This is the region that is constantly seen on the news, where you see North and South Korean soldiers basically having a staring contest at one another. Okay. And Panmunjom, where the demilitarized zone is, to refer to it as a demilitarized zone, again, is a contradiction in terms. It's the most militarized zone anywhere on the planet. Okay, you actually have landmines that are placed in this area, guard towers, barbed wire, men with machine guns willing to shoot and kill at the moment's provocation. Okay, and these peace talks end up lasting over 2 years. On July 27, 1953 is when the armistice is signed between North and South Korea, between the North Koreans, Communist forces, and the UN forces. But it is only a ceasefire. It's only an armistice. Technically, North and South Korea are still at war even to this very day. Okay. In the last year or two, we've seen a couple of steps forward in terms of the progress with this. Donald Trump has actually gone to North Korea, has stepped over into the North Korean side. Kim Jong-un has stepped over to the South Korean side for the first time in history. But we have still seen constant resumption of idle threats that have been made by both sides. Okay, so there doesn't seem to be any real end in sight to the Korean War. It is still going on and has been since 1953. So the demilitarized zone is now still at Panmunjom. This is, again, what you still see in the news today. And it's estimated in terms of the lives lost in the Korean War that there are 33,000 U.S. deaths and roughly 103,000 who are either wounded or missing in the process. South Korea ends up losing roughly 2 million people. And the North Koreans and the Chinese are estimated to have lost about 3 million. The number that actually exists out there, it may never be known because the North Koreans constantly make up numbers to try to make themselves look better over time. So, and we'll constantly see this happen from time to time all throughout the 20th century. Again, though, Harry Truman uses the Korean War as a justification for the Truman Doctrine. He says, The North Koreans immediately invaded South Korea. They were a clear and present danger to capitalism and to democracy, and so we were forced to force our hand here. And so the American military presence is therefore enhanced in Southeast Asia, specifically in Korea, and eventually into French Indochina, which becomes Vietnam. Now at home, communism has already gained a lot of traction as a potential problem in the United States. In 1938, before World War II ever began, the House Committee on Un-American Activities was established. And what this has done is this is a congressional committee that is supposed to investigate and root out communist activity within the U.S. government. Okay. In March of 1947, there is a loyalty order that is actually passed by this group to require federal background checks for all government employees to make sure that they are not directly allied with communist radicals, or that they are not trying to undermine the U.S. government in any way. And the Federal Bureau of Investigation steps in here. Okay, J. Edgar Hoover, who has been the head of the FBI for a couple of decades now, he and the Attorney General Tom Clark believe that there are several spies that are actually at work in the U.S. government. Okay, and so the FBI kind of leads the charge in this series of paranoid events to begin to demoralize the people living in America into believing that communism has managed to seep its way in somehow. And Harry Truman is now under pressure from the FBI and from the American people to make sure that there is no Soviet presence in the U.S. Okay? If he is going to be an effective president with an effective domestic policy, he has to root out communism wherever it exists, not just abroad. So in 1951, the Civil Service Commission ends up clearing over 3 million people, okay, in the midst of all this, right? It examines the contracts and the backgrounds of 3 million people and ends up dismissing 378 out of that large group, okay, saying that these people have too questionable backgrounds to hire them as government employees. 1953, though, Dwight Eisenhower ends up revoking the loyalty order. He believes that this is a bad idea and that it does more to demoralize the American people than to protect them in any way. 1947, in October, House Committee ends up launching the largest and most popular investigation of its tenure by examining the film industry. Okay, and this is what gets the most notoriety in the midst of all this. 10 witnesses who are called before the House end up refusing to testify, okay, because they have various ties to the Communist Party, they have friends who are ideological communists, and they are typically individuals who are screenwriters, producers, and a few directors. Okay. All 10 of these witnesses, though, are cited for contempt by the House of Representatives. They are given prison terms that they are forced to serve, and they are also blacklisted from the film industry. In effect, their lives are ruined. And this becomes a very potent tool by the U.S. government throughout the 1950s. Okay, and being accused of communism during the 1950s in America is probably the closest equivalent that I can come up with in terms of a parallel. It would be the modern equivalent of being accused of pedophilia. Okay, it's something that not only destroys your life, it destroys your reputation, and it's something that you cannot really recover from. Okay, it's something that can effectively ruin a person's entire life. In the midst of all this, the playwright Arthur Miller writes a very influential play called The Crucible, in which he basically does a retelling of the Salem witch trials. Okay, and The Crucible, even though it is supposed to be a retelling of the Salem witch trials, basically draws a direct parallel between the Salem witch trials and the communist so-called witch trials that exist in the 1950s. Okay, it's the same level of unrealistic paranoia that occurs, that it's something that is actually blown out of proportion, and that it's something that is unjustifiable. Meanwhile, in 1948, there is a former Soviet spy that becomes an informer for the federal government named Whittaker Chambers, who you see here. He comes before the House committee and actually becomes an informant against Alger Hiss. Okay, and Alger Hiss is a former State Department employee who is found guilty of leaking secret documents to Chambers in 1938 to try to sell them to the Soviets. Okay. So they are both men are actually accused of spying. Chambers is actually granted a bit of a pardon for informing against Hiss. Okay. Hiss attempts to sue Chambers for libel in the midst of all this to try to basically say that you're just trying to ruin my reputation. But he's convicted of perjury because they find a microfilm document that is actually submitted for evidence, and it ends up convicting him. By 1949, 11 different leaders of the U.S. Communist Party are convicted under the Smith Act. Okay. And the Smith Act specifically allows outlaws any conspiracy in the U.S. to advocate for the overthrow of the government. Okay, and this is something that kind of goes, in a certain degree anyway, against what the founders of the Constitution tried to say, and that is that if there is a government in place that is unreliable or that is corrupt, then the people have the right to rise up and overthrow it. But in this case, the fine line that is drawn here has to do with people trying to overthrow the government for sadistic reasons, for impure reasons. And eventually this is upheld by the Supreme Court under the doctrine of clear and present danger, right? If this is something that the government believes is an actual problem, then it can use, excessive force, basically, to try to suppress it. 1950, the FBI ends up uncovering a spy ring involving several American and British communists who are passing information about the atomic bomb to the Soviets. Klaus Fuchs is one particular individual who is targeted in the midst of this. He is a German-born English nuclear physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project, and he's arrested for selling secrets to the Soviets. And probably the most infamous instance that occurs in the midst of this particular episode involves a New York couple named Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. These are two individuals who are targeted and convicted as former spies in the same ring. And they are actually the very first Americans who are executed for spying. Okay, they're both given the electric chair. The most famous individual at the very epicenter of the so-called witch hunts against communism in the 1950s is Senator Joseph McCarthy of Illinois. And he is the one who leads the primary charge against communism in the United States. He's the one who sows the most discord among people, who leads the House committee, and who tries his best to actually get Americans to turn one another in. And he specifically claims that the State Department is full of communists. He believes that Democrats and Army officers in particular are the primary targets who are the most guilty. In September of 1950, the McCarran Internal Security Act is passed, and this says that it's unlawful to be involved in acts that are supposed to contribute to establishing a totalitarian dictatorship anywhere. Okay? So specifically in the United States. Okay, so it further legitimizes the suppression of communism. And communist organizations that form in the United States, if they are just there for public discourse or something along those lines as philosophical entities, they have to register with the Attorney General to prove that they are not terrorist organizations. And anybody who is an aspiring immigrant who belongs to a totalitarian party in their home country is now barred from entry. Okay, so if you belong to the Communist Party in Russia and you end up trying to immigrate to the United States, the U.S. government says you are not allowed in. And now, during future national emergencies, if we enter into open war with Communist Russia, communists are going to now be herded into concentration camps by the federal government. So the government still has not done away with this particular principle just yet. And by 1951, McCarthyism, as it's known, is at an all-time high. Okay, this level of paranoia and pointing the finger at individuals, again, very similar to trying to basically, destroy a person's reputation today. It becomes nothing more than a groundless smear campaign. Okay, and it ends up destroying lives, destroying reputations, getting people blacklisted from being hired anywhere, despite whatever their industry happens to be. And specifically, Hollywood actors are targeted. Charlie Chaplin, for example, is one who is actually targeted and who refuses to testify before the House and actually becomes an expatriate as a result. He leaves the country altogether and goes and lives in France and doesn't come back until the 1970s. And, unsurprisingly, Jews are also targeted as communist sympathizers, along the same lines as what we saw Nazi Germany trying to assume the relationship between the two, okay? Saying that because so many Jews are like the idea of communism in its purest form, then we're going to associate them with communism. And eventually, McCarthy makes the mistake of accusing George Marshall of being allied with Stalin, okay, the Secretary of State. And when he does that, it's becoming clearer and clearer to Harry Truman that he's not going to be able to seek another term as president. Okay, that the atmosphere of the United States has become far too hostile, and that even if he did have the opportunity, it's something that's not in his best interest. Okay, so again, the government and the society of the United States is not in a very good mindset at this point. We're in a very actionable position where internal conflict could potentially destroy us just as much as external conflict does. And Harry Truman, unfortunately, is suffering from a 25% approval rating. At that point, it was the lowest approval rating of any president in U.S. history. It's only been surpassed once or twice since then.